everyone, and Sam, for making us so welcome this afternoon in Christchurch. It's a privilege to be in this space, and even more so when we can have a look at the manuscripts. The plan is slightly different from what you were sent out in advance. Joe's going to talk to us about the holdings and Gibbons related things, and then we'll have the looking around at the manuscripts rather than doing it the other way around. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jonathan, Joe, to his friends. Many of you will have come across him already. Great scholar in 17th century English music, but with a wide brief, particularly interested in Italian influences in England and how Italian music came. And if you don't know about it, there's a very good book on the 16-tone Vespers by Joe, totally unrelated to what he's talking about today. He's edited music by, amongst others, I did a quick tot, George Jeffreys, Matthew Locke, Angelo Notari, Henry Laws, Walter Porter, Richard Deering, William Child, and there's probably more that I haven't mentioned there. And so there's nobody better, really, than Joe to talk to us about the collections here. He's researched English music for as long as he's been active, really, in musicological research. Latterly as Professor of Music at York University. And I think, like I was when I stood down at Huddersfield, he's quite relieved to have got rid of the head of department role and now has a little bit more time to do the things he really wants to do, which luckily for the Gamba Society includes co-editing the journal with Peter Holman and co-looking after the index of thematic index. So Joe, on many counts, thank you so much and you're very welcome.
Thank you. For that introduction, and may I extend my welcome to this magnificent building. 30 odd years ago, when I was writing my thesis, I lived in that music room upstairs. I do remember it very cold in winter, but it's so nice to be back in this room, and indeed to have the music out there for us all to have a look at. I hope you don't mind just changing things around. It struck me that if we let you look at it first, you'd be asking all those sort of questions which I might be able to start to answer in my talk. So we're going to do it the other way around, but I will definitely leave you a good hour to have a look at that, and I'll be around to answer things. And if there are specific pieces you would like to have a look at, we can find them in those manuscripts. So, as Sam told us, the music library in Christchurch is primarily from the bequest of two musician collectors. First, the aforementioned Dean Henry Aldrich, a 17th century polymath, composer and collector. And then, secondly, the cathedral musician and copyist Richard Goodson the Junior. And it was in the 18th century that the two collections were amalgamated and survive today, more or less intact, upstairs on wooden presses, custom built to accommodate the music collection. It really is a most magnificent collection of manuscripts of particularly English and Italian music, and of printed music before 1700. And as we'll see, it's a really important source of viol consort music, and of course of Orlando Gibbons in particular. So we're concerned primarily, there are lots and lots of different stories I could tell about the music here, but I'm going to try and discipline myself to talk specifically about the manuscripts relating to Orlando Gibbons, which survive in the library. It's necessary, though, for us to push back before Henry Aldrich. Henry Aldrich, of course, late 17th, early 18th century Dean, as you know. Orlando Gibbons, early 17th century, died in 400 years ago. So we need to push back and have a think about where Aldrich got a lot of his music from. I'm going to sound a bit vague about that, for one very good reason, a really annoying reason, and that is that when Dean Aldrich died, he asked for all his correspondence to be destroyed, which was really annoying because it means that we have to reconstruct where Aldrich got this music from by means foul and fair, by looking at bits of other evidence, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. Here I need to introduce the name. Sam's already just mentioned it, but the name of Hatton, the Hatton family. Important for the library collections here, I will argue, but actually, of course, important for Orlando Gibbons and for the sources in the library. So, forgive me a bit, I'm going to spend a bit of time on the Hatton family for reasons which will become clear. This is a family that came to prominence first in Elizabeth I's reign, when Sir Christopher Hatton I became Lord Chancellor. And this first notable Christopher Hatton gained royal favour, apparently in part due to his dancing skills. But he was also a very important Elizabethan nobleman. During his lifetime, he obtained a substantial estate comprising lands in Northamptonshire, Dorset, Cheshire, Oxfordshire, as well as Hatton House and Gardens in London. Christopher Hatton I died without issue, and his estate passed to his sister's son, Sir William Newport, who took the name Hatton. And then on Newport Hatton's death in 1597, many of the estates were inherited by Christopher Hatton II, a godson and second cousin once removed to the Elizabethan Lord Chancellor. Christopher Hatton II had a house in Westminster. Just remember, Orlando Gibbons lived in Westminster from 1603. But the Hatton family's main household was Kirby Hall, a really impressive Elizabethan Jacobean mansion near Corby in Northamptonshire. English heritage, well worth a visit. It's a magnificent building. And it was at Kirby Hall that the royal consort, Queen Anne of Denmark, and then later her husband James I, were entertained on 4 separate occasions between 1605 and 1619. Just bear with me on the Hattons, to explain why I'm whittering on about Hatton, remember that at this point that Sir Christopher Hatton II is well known to anyone interested in Gibbons because he was the patron of Orlando Gibbons. Indeed, Orlando Gibbons' single published collection of secular music, the famous first set of madrigals and motets of 5 parts, act for viols and voices, published in London in 1612, is dedicated to Hatton. You have on the screen the cover, but ignore that. My horrible black and white thing. That's what it looks like, with the gold gilt. How wonderful that is. That is pride of place. And as I'll argue, in that it is the Hatton binding, it's a gold Hatton binding, it's really very important in this Hatton and Gibbons relationship. I'll come back to that in a moment, and of course you can have a proper look at that later. Let me just continue and finish the Hatton story and then get on to Gibbons. Christopher Hatton II died in 1619, and the Hatton estates and libraries passed to his son, another Christopher Hatton III. And I bet you can't work out what he called his son. Damn, yeah. It's an annoyance to scholars that often really quite difficult working out chronologies of things, because they were all called Christopher, and you have to sort of work things out from dates. Christopher Hatton III was born in 1605. Obviously the eldest son of Christopher Hatton II, but important for us vile people is that his mother was Alice Fanshawe, the eldest daughter of Thomas Fanshawe. You remember that the Fanshawe family were important patrons of the musician John Ward, and important therefore in musical circles. Anyway, Christopher Hatton III, not surprisingly, developed his father's great interest in music and the arts. He was educated at Jesus College, Cambridge, matriculating in 1620, and then graduating Master of Arts in 1622. And he maintained links with Cambridge, both the city and the Shire, throughout the 1620s and 30s. Became a member of Parliament in 1625 and served as Justice of Peace for Cambridgeshire almost continuously from 1628 to 1640. At Cambridge, he developed a cultural circle that included the poets and playwrights such as Thomas Randolph and Peter Housestead, and musicians such as George Jeffreys, Stephen Byng and John Lilly. The latter two we'll come back to in a moment. Most importantly, for our purposes, he also amassed a large library, including a lot of music. The core he inherited from his father, but it seems he continually added to that systematically throughout the 1630s. In 1638, Michael East dedicated his 7th set of books to Hatton, where he described Hatton as truly a noble lover of learning and patron of the arts. And it was during this period that Hatton bought a lot of Italian music from the London bookseller Robert Martin. And proof of this comes in a bill of sale from 1638, which survives in the Northamptonshire Record Office. Hatton bought a lot of Italian music directly from a London bookseller, who very kindly published catalogues of the music he had for sale. There is just one page from one of the 5 catalogues. I put it on the Monteverdi page, so you can sort of see the sort of music that was available for purchase in London. This is Italian music, sometimes hot off the presses, arriving in London to be purchased by noblemen like Christopher Hatton. Those of you with a keen eye will notice a rather lovely misprint. Lost it myself, but yeah, Lamenta Dariano, Lamento Dariano, but there you are. So this was music available for sale in London, and Christopher Hatton III bought this music, and a lot of it is on the shelves upstairs there. This is the evidence which started me in reconstructing the Hatton collection. Just about see to the right, Worshipful Christopher Hatton, November 1638. And there's a list of 25 music prints, and there I've put them in alphabetical order at the side there. Every one of those is upstairs in the Christchurch music collection. And that was the start. I won't go into it now, but that was the start of how I reconstructed the Hatton music collection. Anyone interested in finding out more about that, there is this prize winner for the most boring book in 1997, which gives you the full story of that. So if you want to have a look at that and cure your insomnia, do have a look at that. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but that is the sort of fundamental, the starting point for me reconstructing the Hatton collection. I need to get onto the Gibbons manuscript, so let me very quickly just summarise the rest of Hatton III's career. And frankly, in comparison to his exalted status as a patron of the arts, initially his political and court career was unspectacular. That is, until the outbreak of civil war. Most noblemen, that was bad news. For Christopher Hatton, who became, as Sam said, controller of the King's household in the Oxford years when the court was based in this very college. That was Hatton's high point. He became controller of the King's household. It also meant he could ignore the chaos of his private life. He was terribly in debt at the start of the Civil War, and he threw himself into the King's cause. I say terribly in debt. It didn't stop him buying acres of music and having Kirby Hall rebuilt. He was a fascinating character. But this was the high point of Christopher Hatton's career, the Civil War years here in Christchurch. And his support for the Royalist cause was recognised in 1643 when he was raised to the peerage as Baron Hatton of Kirby, at the period when he became controller of the King's household, and as Sam suggested, was probably responsible for music making in the privy chambers of Charles I in this very college. And there is another story. Henrietta Maria was just across the road there in Merton College, where she had her Roman Catholic chapel in the chapel of Merton. And if you believe the Wainwright theory, that was where a lot of this Italian music was performed, this Roman Catholic music, copied by Hatton's scribes. So I think the Civil War period is the period where Hatton is most influential in terms of court. Of course, it's going to end in tears because the Civil War, Oxford fell in 1646, and Hatton did what all sensible royalists did. and after visiting Kirby Hall and London, he went abroad to Paris. He legged it and got away from England. Frankly, thereafter, the story of Hatton is really rather a sad one. He was involved in Paris in various intrigues with the Queen Henrietta Maria, who of course was also in exile over there. While he was away, the Hatton estates were sequestrated by the parliamentarians, and his family were devastated, lands were confiscated, etc., etc. He managed to return to England in 1656, when his estates were in absolute chaos. Indeed, the diarist John Evelyn, who had visited Kirby Hall in 1654, had found, quote, the seat naked, and indeed much of the precious Hatton library had by that stage been dispersed. Indeed, it is my theory that Henry Aldrich was one of the people who bought the Hatton materials, the music in particular, hence, as I'm about to explain, the survival of the Hatton collection in Christchurch here today. So apologies for that rather long examination of the Hatton family. If it seems out of all proportion, let me get to Gibbons now and explain why Gibbons is so important to the Christchurch collection and vice versa. So I started with that, as I showed you, this wonderful, wonderful ornate copy binding of the first set of madrigals, motets and madrigals and motets, 5 parts, act for viols and voices. And you'll have the opportunity to look at this later after I've finished talking. But I'm going to suggest to you that this is Gibbons' actual presentation copy to his patron, Sir Christopher Hatton II. Now I say this because the dark brown calf binding of each part book is exquisitely crafted. As you saw when I held it up, richly gilt, and at the centre is the Hatton crest. A crest upon a torso, hind stantant or, apparently. As I mentioned before, the publication is dedicated to Sir Christopher Hatton II, with his coat of arms opposite the title page of the dedication on each of the part books. So there's the Hatton coat of arms, and there is the dedication to Sir Christopher Hatton II, in which he says the pieces, quote, were most of them composed in your own house. The language they spake, you provided them. That could, I suppose, mean that Hatton II wrote some of the words. It could, of course, mean that Hatton II also provided the context for poets to write those words. We'll never really know that. These bindings of this set, with this wonderful, wonderful gold stamping, and indeed we know that the corner pieces have been identified as tools from the workshop of John Bateman, a bookbinder by appointment to James I. So this is expensive, this is extravagant, it really is a very special set. And I think it's very likely, given the dedication, that this is the actual Gibbons presentation copy to his patron, Christopher Hatton II. So that book I just held, Orlando Gibbons probably held this as well, and that just gives me the shivers a bit. Gibbons' only published collection of madrigals is, as is well known to you, Act for Viols and Voices. And to give you a rest from my voice, let's listen to a rather popular piece, a rather well-known piece from this collection. Tessa Bonner and the Rose Consort. And indeed, I think when performed in that manner, that is not with the usual 5 voices, the link with the English consort song tradition, rather than that of the Italian madrigal, becomes really rather more apparent. Let's move then to viol consort sources and Gibbon's sources in Christchurch. Now, the most obvious surviving example from the Hatton collection, apart from the Gibbons we've just seen, is another set of viol consort part books, Music 432 and 612 to 613. That's 2 part books and an organ book of fantasias and airs for 2 bass viols and organ. And the music is by Coprario, Jenkins and Ward. And then the organ book also contains Miko's 3-part fantasias. Let me just hold one of them up. Again, you can see this is a special binding, and there in the middle is the Hatton coat of arms, again richly gilt. So this is another of those obvious Hatton survivals in Christchurch, and a really important set of consort music. So it has a dark blue Morocco rich gilt binding which contains the full Hatton coat of arms, azure, a chevron between 3 guards, or flanked with the inscription Christopher Hatton Deoret Patriae, and then encircled by a ribbon from which hangs the ensign medallion of the Order of Bath. So again, my suggestion is that this is a set specifically commissioned by the Hatton family. Now, the copies of this set are 2 Hatton-associated musicians whose hands have been identified by Pamela Willits, David Pinto and others. John Lilly, who copied the part books and the first section of the organ book, and Stephen Byng, who copied the Miko Fantasias and the reverse of the organ book. I'm not going to have time to go into Lilly and Stephen Byng in detail. You can read of it elsewhere in my book, but if there's any questions on those 2 wonderful copies, do catch me later, and I'm very happy to give you line and verse on that. But at this point, I'll just note that the parts of the Miko part pieces appear in another Hatton-related set which we've got on the table here, Christchurch Music 417 and 18 and 1018. Now this set was entirely copied by Stephen Byng, and this set I've nicknamed the Byng set. And as you'll see when you have a look at it, it doesn't have a Hatton binding. It has a rather standard later 17th century binding, the so-called Aldrich binding. This is because when Dean Aldrich got hold of the Hatton collection, it seems he organised it and had it all bound in a rather wonderful, rather extravagant leather bindings with late 17th century stamps on it, the so-called Aldrich bindings. And he organised the Hatton collection into 3 sections. You get the Fants, the Fantasias, each book labelled Fant, and you get Mads for madrigals, and another series, the Mots, the motets. And there again, all upstairs in the library here. It's primarily, as you'll see, a speckled brown leather with blind tool motifs with 3-pointed buds, with then the labelling on the spine. This beam set, which is actually incomplete, it lacks the tenor book for the 4-part pieces. It contains the 3- and 4-part viol consort music by Bull, Coprario, Frescobaldi, Ferrabosco II, Orlando Gibbons, of course, Jeffreys, another Hatton household musician, Lupo, Miko, and Ward. And another time for another break from my voice. Here is the Gibbons 3-part Fantasia, number 1, performed by Phantasm, which is in the Byng set. Now, with the exception of the three-part Fantasias by George Jeffreys, the whole contents of the Bing set are duplicated in another collection of instrumental music copied jointly by Stephen Bing and John Lilly. This is a set known actually as the Great Set of Consort Music. It's in the middle there. You can see Christchurch 2, which is the score book. There is the organ book there. Then the whole sets of parts, 397 to 400 are the four-part works, 401 to 2 are the three-part works, lacking the treble book, and then music 403 to 8 are the 5 and 6-part works, and all in the organ book music 436. This is an astounding collection. It's a comprehensive collection of the larger scale viol consort music from the earlier Stuart period. It almost contains every bit of music from that period. It really is astoundingly complete. And of course it's a really important source for Orlando Gibbons' works, of course. Now the set doesn't have Hatton bindings, which I think is significant. The parts in the organ book are in the Aldrich bindings, and the Great Scorebook has a modern binding. Indeed, a catalogue of 1787 describes the binding as rough calf, presumably so rough that it was replaced in the early 20th century. Now, the Great Consort set, as I said, contains a large proportion of the 3 to 6 part English viol consort music repertoire written before the mid to late 1630s. Our interest in Gibbons, it includes the 3-part Fantasias, his second 5-part in Nomine, a 6-part Pavane and Galliard. And just before that Pavane and Galliard is a sequence of 6 anonymous Fantasias, which are unique to the Great Set. Now, since the works of other composers are always grouped together in the Great Set, I think it's reasonable to suggest that the whole of this group of pieces are by Gibbons. Stylistically, there is nothing to suggest that or argue against the idea that those anonymous Fantasias are not Gibbons. And I think, given the Hatton and Gibbons links, I think it becomes very likely. Indeed, the Camden Society are very happy to actually put those anonymous Fantasias as likely to be by Orlando Gibbons. The scribe of the Great Set, Stephen Bing and John Lilly, or their organising patron, Christopher Hatton, would have needed access to a very large number of manuscript sources in a relatively short period of time, I think. The scribal copying, as you'll see when you have a look, is just so neat and so regular that it shows all the signs of being copied in a relatively short period of time. My suggestion is that the provenance of this has to be connected to the court in some way, I think through the Hatton family, where he had access to all this court viol consort music. The other thing to say is that 4 of the most eminent composers of consort music represented in this set, Ferrabosco II, Coprario, Orlando Gibbons and Lupo, they'd all been employed by Charles I when he was still Prince of Wales. Charles was a most discerning patron of music, and if we believe John Playford's report in 1683, Charles I was himself a skilled performer on the bass viol. And Playford reports that, quote, Charles could play his part exactly well on the bass viol, especially those incomparable fancies of Mr. Coprario to the organ. Now, in another set, which I haven't got down, I thought we wouldn't crowd the table too much, but there's another set upstairs, Christchurch Music 732 to 5, and then it has its companion organ book, which is today in the Royal Music Collection in the British Library. But that is a set which includes Coprario's Fantasias for the 2 bass viols and organ. And these sets, there are other sets here that have Coprario's Fantasia suites for 1, 2 or 2 violins, bass viol and organ. Coprario was one of the first composers, as you know, to use the violin in contrapuntal consort music. the violin first appeared in England at the English court in the 1540s, but it was around 1620 that it suddenly became established as an instrument for serious instrumental music, and composers began experimenting with new forms and scorings using mixed groups of violins and viols and keyboard, and possibly theorbo as a continuum. And here it's important that Prince Charles formed an ensemble of viols and violins in 1622 known as Coprario's music. And that group consisted of Lupo, Woodington and Valet on violins, Ferravosco second and Coprario on viols, and of course Orlando Gibbons on keyboard. And one of the new forms to emerge from this, let's call it experimental period of new scorings in viol consort, was the Fantasia suite. A fixed three-movement sequence of Fantasia and two dances Armand Galliard, which was created by Coprario and seems to have remained a court genre until after the Civil War, when it then became more widely disseminated. Coprario's Fantasia suites were copied by Stephen Bing and others in Christchurch Music 732-4 and that Royal Music manuscript I mentioned. And the set also contains Orlando Gibbons' 3- and 4-part great double bass fantasias, so called because they use an instrument a size larger and tuned a fourth lower than the usual bass file. Perhaps these pieces were also as the result of the experiments with scorings that were taking place in court circles in the 1620s. So if I can get the right track, let's listen to the first double bass fantasia played by the parley of instruments. No, I did. Yes, yeah, that's right. finish off on the great set by mentioning another feature of instrumental performance in the Stuart period. And that is that tradition of playing untexted vocal works on instruments. I've got the great set scorebook open at a page at the beginning of the sequence of, I think there are 23 textless 5-voice madrigals and motets by Lupo, Marenzio, Monteverdi, Palafrutino, Vecchi and Ward, which demonstrates that tradition of playing madrigals on viol consorts. Now this so fascinated Dean Aldrich when he got hold of this collection that he went through the books identifying the madrigals, and at the top it's the only annotations in the whole of these sets. It is Dean Aldrich writing in the identification of the madrigal. You'll be able to see that in a moment. It actually, I have to say, it did cause absolute confusion for many years because, of course, the early 20th century scholars who first worked on this, they quite understandably associated Dean Aldrich's handwriting with the music hand. So the early books all say that these were copied by Dean Aldrich. And it was only Pamela Willits and David Pinto who you know, as late as that when they actually said, well, hang on, this just doesn't really add up. And we worked out it was Stephen Byng and John Lilly, the main copyists of this set. But anyway, that's another story. Let me finish on the great set and just say that watermark and scribal evidence shows that the great set, and indeed the Byng and Hatton sets, are the product of court-related circle of scribes working in the mid to late 1630s. And Hatton, with his court links, was undoubtedly the force behind Lilly and Byng's copying of the sets of viol consort music. When you have a look through these collections, you'll see that there are numerous blank pages, ruled but no music entered on them, because all three of these sets are to some degree or other unfinished. And I've suggested that the great set at least was perhaps intended as a presentation copy from Hatton to the king, but was left incomplete when the Civil War hit and everything fell to pieces. As such, it is possible that the manuscripts represent one of the last great musical enterprises of the Royalist court before the outbreak of Civil War. Now, there are lots more questions lingering here. We've got the Hatton set with the Hatton bindings, we've got the Byng set, both superseded by the Hatton, by the great set. Why are they incomplete? Why is repertoire in Hatton and Byng then copied into the great set? We'll never really know. David Pinto has written a very, very detailed article in, I think it was in the last ever Chalice or something, but it was a few years ago, where he has a real go in a David-like way at trying to get around that issue. We'll never really know, but it does look as if somehow the great set superseded the Hatton and Byng set. I think it's significant that the great set doesn't have a Hatton binding, possibly because it was going to be given a Royalist binding had things worked out better. But I have to say, I am guessing here, and we will probably never really know. All I do know is that it's, even in its incomplete state, in their incomplete state, these are three of the most wonderful survivals of viol consort music from the 17th century. I'm running out of time. I must let you have time to look at them and ask questions. But I do just want to move on to another really important Christchurch manuscript relating to Gibbon's music. This is Christchurch 21. Again, you'll see it there. It's a really important source, or early source, of music by Orlando Gibbon. It's from the 1620s. And I think it may too be connected with the Hatton family. Now this manuscript score, together with music by Coprario and various Italian madrigals, the scorebook contains 8 of Gibbon's 3-part fantasias, 4 6-part fantasias, complete untexted copies of the 1612 madrigals and motets with variant readings. That really is interesting. Different tradition to the printed collection. Again, that backs up what I was saying about playing madrigals on the viols. You'll see in the manuscript, you get an incipit. It says The Silver Swan, but there's no other text. So it was designed for playing. But, and probably most important of all, and Katie mentioned this morning, this source is a really important collection for the transmission of Gibbon's consort anthems, that is, verse anthems with viol accompaniment, rather than the standard liturgical organ accompaniment. And 5 of these pieces are unique to this manuscript. So if it wasn't for Christ Church 21, our whole idea of Gibbon's church music would be altered. Most importantly, and most interestingly for us, the manuscript is packed with really authoritative annotations added by the first anonymous scribe, which appear to indicate that the manuscript was very closely connected with Gibbon's or his circle. So, the piece that Katie talked about this morning, CC the Word Incarnate, we learn in this manuscript that the words were made by Dr. Goodman, Dean of Rochester. Singing to the Lord was, quote, made for Dr. Marshall, and this is the record of John for St. John the Baptist's Day, was made for Dr. Ward, President of St. John's, Oxford. Lots of vital bits of information, and that's a cue for another musical example. If I can find, I think it's this one. Redbird and Roses.
Charles Daniels.
Charles Daniels, either been authentic or imitating the Dorset yokel, whichever one you fancy. Let me just be slightly cheeky, just play you the opening of, let's call it the cathedral version of this piece, just to stress. Robin Blaze from Winchester. Just to give you an idea of the performance traditions we have today, and probably then as well. Let's not pretend that domestic music making would have been the same as cathedral music making at that time, but who knows. Let me quickly finish, give you time for questions and then to have a look. I should just say, Music 21, this really important Gibbon source, at the beginning of it was later owned by Benjamin Rogers, the later 17th century owner of the manuscript. And Benjamin Rogers writes in the folio 1 of the manuscript, he writes, "This scorebook was done formally by that rare musician, Mr. Orlando Gibbons." And this gave rise to the idea that the manuscript was actually in the hand of Orlando Gibbons. Unfortunately, I have to say, I don't think the evidence adds up, and I don't think that really can be substantiated. I do think, though, that Rogers realised just how important to Gibbons, if you like, this manuscript was. It's obviously someone quite close to Gibbons and his circle. I think that it's very likely connected to the Hatton family as well. I know it's my thing, so everything has to be connected to the Hatton family, but let me just try and argue this. David Pinto supports me on this one actually as well, because he noted that it's even more likely to connect to the Hattons when you realise that the printed copy sources of the Italian madrigals in Christchurch 21, copied by the second scribe, probably in the 1630s, they all appear to have been copied from printed sources upstairs in the Hatton collection. So I think that is a sort of added evidence. So in the manuscript there are madrigals and motets by Gesualdo, Merula, Messino, Monteverdi, Nenna, printed sources, all which survive upstairs, and all, if you believe the Wainwright theory, came from the Hatton collection. However, I'll just be fair and argue against myself a bit here. If this manuscript, as some of the evidence seems to suggest, was once part of the Hatton collection, it did find its way to Christchurch via a different route to the other Gibbons-related manuscripts that I've been talking about. The annotation on the first page of Christchurch Music 21, in the hand of Benjamin Rogers, the one-time owner, he informs that the manuscript was given to him by the stationer John Playford on the 18th of August 1673. And what's more, the score was part of the Richard Goodson bequest to Christchurch, not that of Henry Aldrich. So if this manuscript was part of the Hatton collection, it must at some stage, perhaps in 1670 following Hatton's death, have become separated from the rest of the collection and was bought by Playford in the belief that it was Gibbons' autograph. And then it passed from Playford to Rogers in August 1673. And then on Rogers' death in 1698, it came into the possession of Richard Goodson the Younger, and then finally the Goodson bequest to Christchurch, where it might have been reunited with the rest of the Hatton collection. So as usual, when you're constructing these sorts of bits of evidence, things are never quite absolutely plain sailing. But I think enough to say that it is possibly connected to the Hatton collection, but it is most certainly connected to Orlando Gibbons. I'm fast running out of time. I'll just say that I have put out, or Sam has put out for us, the incomplete copy of the printed Gibbons Fantasies of 3 parts, printed in London around 1620. It's lacking the 10 book, but it's there. It was probably, it's part of the Aldrich bequest, so probably part of the Hatton collection as well. We just lost one part along the way. And that's all I'm going to say. I think I do want you to go and have a look at this, and I'm very, very happy to answer questions when you're looking at it, and of course I'm very happy to answer questions now before you go and have a look around. So thank you for letting me Twitter. Thank you.